Our president is simply too unstable to carry out the duties of the highest executive office in the land. They say the president has captured the Republican Party in Washington. As he himself might tweet, sad. It's even sadder that Republicans in Washington, many of them, exhibit all the symptoms of Stockholm Syndrome, identifying with their captor.
That was former Massachusetts Republican Governor Bill Weld today, not holding back on Trump or his Republican allies in Congress. But even that probably didn't make Donald Trump as angry as when Governor Weld said this.
Because of the many concerns I've talked about today, I have established an exploratory committee to pursue the possibility of my running for the presidency of the United States as a Republican in the 2020 election.
All right, that is a former Republican governor officially announcing that he is taking the first steps to primary Donald Trump in 2020. Weld actually has run on a presidential ticket before. In 2016, he ran as the vice presidential candidate on the Libertarian ticket alongside Gary Johnson. But this time around, Weld is preparing to run as a Republican for what could turn out to be the first viable primary challenge against an incumbent since Pat Buchanan challenged George H.W. Bush back in 1992. The Trump presidency has caused a major rift among many of the Republican Party's longtime stalwarts, some of whom have left the party altogether in protest. Now, that could be an opportunity for Weld, but despite some high-profile dissenters, Trump remains historically popular among self-identified Republican voters, at least right now. Joining me now is someone who knows better than anyone else what this means for President Trump in 2020. Larry Sabato is the director of the University of Virginia Center for Politics and the founder of Sabato's Crystal Ball Weekly Political Analyst. Larry, good to see you again. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Alan.
When we talk about a viable potential challenge, there have been names that have come up. Larry Hogan of Maryland, John Kasich gets talked about. A lot of people wondering whether Mitt Romney's re-entry into politics is about this. Where does Weld sit in that pantheon?
Where he sits is he's serious about it. You know, the other ones, I haven't seen any real sign they're serious or that they're making moves to do it. Maybe they're all waiting for the Mueller report, Allie. That may be the trigger for some of them to get in or not. But look, it's more significant than people think, because since Eisenhower, if an incumbent is seriously challenged by somebody who's vigorous and who ends up getting a decent percentage of the vote, even in New Hampshire, it signals that that incumbent is in trouble in the fall. On the other hand, if you're unopposed, if you have no serious challenger, all of them in modern history have, in fact, gotten the second term. So it's a great signal.
Let's talk about the politics of it, though, because Donald Trump continues to maintain a base somewhere between 30 and 40%. Some of those people are conservatives who like low taxes. Some are people whose main concern is the Second Amendment, and some are people for whom their main concern is abortion. If a guy like Weld or any other moderate Republican comes into the race and siphons off some of those people and siphons off maybe some Democrats, it still leaves Donald Trump with a solid base of people who tend to be the people who turn out for primaries.
Oh, absolutely. You wouldn't expect any challenger to win. No modern challenger has beaten an incumbent, although Ronald Reagan came awfully close to Gerald Ford in 1976. So it's possible, but I think it's very unlikely. But again, once you have that challenger in there making points, and Bill Weld is a good public speaker. He's got a sharp tongue. He's experienced, 2 terms winning as governor in Massachusetts and other losing races, but he's been out there on the trail. This guy's too liberal to be nominated by the Republican Party, but he's a good opponent for Trump if, in fact, he runs.
What happens for never-Trumpers, for Republicans who have forsworn Donald Trump or who want some other solution, but they'd like a Republican, they'd like maybe a conservative candidate? What's the best scenario? A bunch of guys, a bunch of people like William Weld getting into the race, or one?
Well, it can happen. Nixon in 1972 had a conservative congressman run against him, Republican Congressman John Ashbrook, and a liberal Republican Congressman, Pete McCloskey, who was anti-war. So he had the shots coming at him from both sides. It's possible that will happen, but it's also possible that Trump will end up with a minor opponent who will end up doing surprisingly well in New Hampshire. They love to stir the pot. They often give 20, 25, 30% or more to a challenger to an incumbent president, but then it tends to fade.
Larry, always good to talk to you. Thank you, sir.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.